As I said at the beginning of the show, this is a story of generations. This story, like all stories, is a story of generations, fathers and sons, and cycles and networks, and the rise and fall of nations. So you could say that in the 1990s, there was a different generation of this battle. There were the paleocons and the neocons, just as there are now, paleocons, America Firsters, and neocons. But I want to focus a little bit more on William F. Buckley, because as Ron Unz writes in his article, the major attack against Pat Buchanan did not come from Tucker Carlson.
And Pat Buchanan, just so you guys know, was a politician. Let me pull him up for you guys real quick. So you guys, American paleo-conservative author, political commentator, and politician. He was the assistant and special consultant to U.S. President Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Ronald Reagan. Influential figure in the modern paleo-conservative movement in the United States. This guy was very critical of our foreign policy back in the day, okay, when it wasn't popular to be so, when it came to us going into foreign wars for Israel. One of the few first people to call this bullshit out back in the day. Pat Buchanan, real G, man.
At that time, Tucker Carlson was a very low-level journalist, barely got on television, and was not really into public broadcasting. And his attack on Buchanan came in 1999, many years after the initial controversy in 1991.
And I'll bring this up to 1.25 speed because we do have to do Fresh and Fit in a little bit, guys. So we'll cover some of this stuff. And this came from his show last week, which is a good show, guys, if you guys want to check it out in full. He goes over not just Tucker Carlson, but also goes over how the neoconservative base in America came to be, which we all know really means, and how they were able to basically get involved in American foreign policy and take it over.
The major attack against Buchanan came from William F. Buckley, who at that time, if you understand anything about the history of the conservative movement, William F. Buckley was considered the intellectual leader of the conservative movement in America. Ron Unz calls him the quasi-pope. And it was William F. Buckley who founded National Review in the 1950s, at the beginning of the Cold War, after World War II. It was William F. Buckley that throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, he is the one that really created the modern...
Just to put a face to the name, here he is. William Frank Buckley was an American conservative writer, public intellectual, political commentator, and novelist. He's not alive anymore, but again, shaped a lot of this way of thinking that we have now.
Modern doctrine of conservatism. He was behind Barry Goldwater in 1964. He was the intellectual heavyweight behind the fusionist coalition that brought Reagan to power in 1980. So William F. Buckley was the leader of the conservatives, in many ways similar to Tucker Carlson today, or you could argue somebody like Ben Shapiro or somebody like Charlie Kirk. William F. Buckley was dominant. I would argue more dominant than any of them today back in the 1980s and 1990s. As I said, William F. Buckley wrote a 40,000-word hit piece on Buchanan in 1991 called In Search of Anti-Semitism, filled up a whole issue of the magazine, published as a book, and it sought to cancel Pat Buchanan and push him out of the race so that he could not challenge George Bush in 1992. Now, I want to talk about who William F. Buckley is, because when we work through the biography of William F. Buckley, we're going to discover some startling themes, some startling patterns. And you'll notice there's many of these patterns that show up over and over and over again in consistent themes. Before we get into William F. Buckley, it is important to talk about the CIA and where the CIA came from and how the CIA operates, what its mission is, among other things. Because again, if you go back to last week, my criticism of Tucker Carlson, the central question is Tucker Carlson in the CIA? We talked about his father. We talked about Voice of America. He accused me of being in the CIA. He attacked Pat Buchanan along the same lines that William F. Buckley did 10 years earlier. I want to talk about the CIA and establish some important things to understand about how they operate first, to understand all these stories. So where did the CIA actually come from? The CIA is established in 1947, but it was preceded by an organization called the OSS.
Hey, man. O/Squad of the House. That's where we got the name from, guys. Office of Strategic. Shout out to the OSS. And if you guys know, right, of Strategic Services, boom. That's where we got the emblem from, by the way, too, with the skull. But anyway, let's get back to it, because we don't have much time, so.
And this was a wartime intelligence organization that was started during World War II in the aftermath
Now the OSS is us, ninjas.
of some sabotage attacks in New York City and other espionage that was happening during the war on the part of the Germans and the Axis powers that we were fighting. So the OSS forms up. That's the precursor to the CIA. It's a wartime intelligence outfit. Now, we're not going to go into all the particulars and details. There's a couple of things we need to understand about the CIA during World War II and shortly afterward at the beginning of the Cold War. In the first place, some of the most important sources, confidential sources that provided human intelligence for the OSS during World War II came through Italy. The United States invades Italy in 1943. They take over the Italian peninsula, and this is like their springboard into the European continent to fight Hitler and to fight the European Axis powers. The OSS rapidly establishes themselves inside of Italy. And one of the biggest sources of intelligence during the war for the OSS was Jewish refugees that fled Nazi-occupied territory through Italy. The Nazis occupied a vast swath of territory in Germany, in Austria, all over Northern Europe, where a lot of Jews lived. And when the Jews were fleeing Nazi captivity or persecution, they fled to Italy, where they were not going to be subjected to some of the anti-Semitic policies, and ultimately where they were liberated by the United States when the U.S. invaded and landed there. Now, the Jewish refugees fled Germany and Austria into Italy, and they provided a massive source of confidential intelligence for U.S. wartime intelligence. And you have to understand why that is. Those Jewish refugees had information about Germany, about Austria. What's more, they spoke the language. They spoke German. They spoke the lingua franca of the Nazi Empire. Also, they were hostile to the Nazi Empire, being Jews. So these Jews that were leaving Nazi Germany, these are like ready-made intelligence.
And you know, it's interesting. I'm looking at Twitter right now, and people are, as expected, people are trying to say that Nick is a Fed. Bro, they're doing everything they can to stop him, bro. It's inevitable. It's inevitable that he's going to fucking take over, and they're fucking terrified. Oh, bro, let's go ahead and bring up this lie again that he's a Fed. Oh, come on, man.
Intelligence units because they hate the enemy, they speak the enemy's language, and they used to live on the enemy's territory. So very quickly, in the 1940s, U.S. wartime intelligence is using these Jewish refugees to get information on the Nazis. They're using Jewish refugees as intelligence agents, penetrating Nazi Germany along the border. The person that ran this intelligence operation was a guy named James Jesus Angleton.
Okay, I talked to you guys about James Jesus Angleton a lot when it comes to JFK. He is the one that ended up like working very closely with the Israelis to help them get their nuclear program. But this is him, just so you guys have a name to the face. Talked about him a lot, chat. If you watch my JFK stuff, this guy was a critical component to the JFK assassination.
He was in charge of all of the OSS operations on the Italian peninsula, and he got in charge a little bit later, but he got there in 1943 with the rest of the Allies. And it was Angleton who was running this operation. And Angleton saw the value of these Jewish refugees as intelligence officers. They were a great asset for what would become the CIA. This is important to understand. Now, later on, of course, the Allies win World War II. We defeat Nazi Germany. And in the next 5 years after the war is won, the United States enters a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And all of a sudden, the Soviet Union becomes the primary adversary. 1947, the OSS becomes the CIA. James Angleton becomes one of the founding fathers of the CIA. And he is put in charge of being a liaison between U.S. intelligence and foreign intelligence agencies. 1948, the State of Israel is declared. They declare their independence. They fight a brief war with the Arabs. The U.S. recognizes them. And James Angleton begins liaising with Israeli intelligence as part of his job description, founding father of the CIA, running counterintelligence, and working as a liaison with our allied intel agencies. Pursuant to the emerging Cold War, the Soviet Union became our primary adversary. But there was a big problem. An Iron Curtain had descended onto Europe. The Soviets were not letting anybody leave the Soviet Union, or later on, the Warsaw Pact countries. The Soviet Union was a closed-off society. Joseph Stalin made it like a fortress. And so, in the early days of the CIA, in the early days of the Cold War, we had no knowledge of what was happening inside the Soviet Union. We had no human intelligence, no sources that were inside of Russia, and Stalin had created this impenetrable fortress. There was no way to get in. That is until the 1950s. During the 1950s, there was a major aliyah An aliyah is when the Jewish people leave their country from the diaspora and go to Israel. There's been many waves of aliyahs over the years. I think there's 6 or 7 major aliyahs. This is when a Jew makes their pilgrimage, they leave and they return to the Holy Land to reside in Israel. In the 1950s, there was a major aliyah of Jews. Russia had a massive Jewish population. They left the Soviet Union and went to Israel. James Angleton understood the value of Jewish refugees as an intelligence source. Just as in Italy during World War II, Austrian and German Jews were very helpful human sources to tell us secrets about Nazi Germany, and they spoke the language and they carried out operations and they knew about those countries in which they resided. Angleton, now running the foreign desk at the newly created CIA, he saw the value in Jewish refugees that left the Soviet Union and went to Israel. And so James Angleton began a working relationship with.
He was very close with the with what would later become the Mossad and the Israeli intelligence agencies after World War II.
The Israeli intelligence agencies like Shin Bet and Mossad.
Shin Bet is the FBI version, Israel's FBI equivalent. Shin Bet is their internal security service, and then Mossad is the CIA equivalent external security service.
And a quid pro quo relationship was established. Israel understood, just like Angleton did, the value of the intelligence that the Jews leaving Russia had for the United States. And Israel was not going to give that intelligence away for free. As the Jewish refugees left Russia and came into Israel, the Israeli intelligence agencies like Shin Bet would pick them up off the street and interview them. They would gather all the information and put them under confidence. They would gather all the information that the Russian Jewish refugees had, and they would go to their liaison from the CIA, James Angleton, and they would offer him a deal. The Israeli intelligence agencies would say, if you give us American intelligence on our adversaries, like Egypt and Syria, if you give us intelligence on nuclear weapons, then we will give you the intelligence from our Jewish refugees that left Russia. That was the quid pro quo relationship that went from the 1950s until Angleton left the Israel desk in the early 1970s. So from the very beginning, from the 40s during the time of the OSS in World War II, through to the beginning and the height of the Cold War in the time of the CIA, you have to understand that U.S. intelligence and Israeli intelligence, in particular Jewish refugees, were inextricably connected. So much so, many people talk about the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the role of the CIA in it. People point to James Angleton. James Angleton managed a team of hundreds of people with a black budget. Many of them oversaw the handling of John F. Kennedy's assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. The people that opened Lee Harvey Oswald's mail and read it. The people that met with him in real life. They were Jewish. They were Jewish refugees from Russia. And they were a part of Angleton's hand-picked team working with a black budget, liaising with the state of Israel. The CIA and Israeli intelligence from the jump were intertwined like this. And the reason for this is not hard to understand. This is another thing to comprehend about the CIA before we get into William F. Buckley. James Jesus Angleton was not Jewish. He was American. He came from Idaho. And you might say, was he Jewish? Was he secretly Jewish? What was the motivation? It was pretty simple. James Angleton was a virulent and fierce anti-communist. He would do anything to fight the Soviet Union. And in the 1950s, when we had no idea what was happening in Russia, he would do anything to get his hands on intelligence about Russia and about the Soviet Union, even if it meant working with the Israelis, even if it meant giving the Israelis classified information about nuclear weapons. What's more, James Angleton saw Israel as an ally against the Soviet Union in the Middle East. After 1955, Egypt and Syria were armed by the Soviet Union. They received weapons, tanks, planes, and over the 50s, 60s, and 70s, moved further and further into the orbit of the Soviet Union. And on the great chessboard of communism versus capitalism during the Cold War, the CIA and the Defense Department, all these different anti-communists, they saw Israel as a bulwark against Soviet communist influence in the Middle East. So that was the basis of their cooperation. Just like in World War II, they wanted to defeat the Nazis so that the United States could liberate Europe. During the Cold War, they wanted to defeat the Soviet Union. That's why they backed Israel and used Jews as an intelligence agency, effectively. Something else was created in the 1950s. This is the last thing we need to establish about the CIA before we get into William F. Buckley. What the CIA was really worried about in the 1950s was the ideological battle that the communists were waging on America. Because in addition to the Cold War being an arms race, a space race, being fought in proxy wars in Asia, Latin America, and in the Middle East, it was also an ideological battle. And in the same way that the Soviet Union was providing weapons and building nuclear weapons and doing all of these conventional or non-conventional military activities, the Soviet Union was also supporting an international communist element. They were backing communist political parties. They were backing communist book clubs, campus organizations, backing communist intellectuals. And if you know anything about the Red Scare, which happened in the 20s and then again in the 50s, and really was in place throughout the duration of the existence of the Soviet Union, the US government and CIA, first the FBI, then the CIA, were very concerned about communist and Soviet penetration of American society through the use of spies, double agents, pushing communist ideology. So just like the Soviets, the CIA also engaged in an information ideological war. The Soviets gave weapons, the CIA gave weapons. The Soviets fought proxy wars, so did the CIA. The Soviets developed a space program for the purpose of missiles, so did the CIA with Project Paperclip. And just like the Soviet Union had communist ideological allies all across the world, so did the CIA. In the 1950s, the CIA backed a program called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And I'll read this blurb about it. This is from Wikipedia. It says, in 1950, a group of intellectuals founded an organization called the Congress for Cultural Freedom with the aim of consolidating an anti-totalitarian intellectual community around the globe. The CCF's connections with the United States CIA were definitively established 16 and 17 years later in reports by the New York Times and Ramparts magazine.
Hey, look at Mo. He's styling, bro. I didn't even know I made hoodies that big, nigga. Damn.
This whole thing? It's just something I picked up.
Hey, that looks pretty nice, man. You style?
They claimed that the CIA, operating through a series of dummy foundations, had been instrumental in organizing and funding the CCF. Two people who were critical at the very beginning, and this will be important later, are Irving Kristol and James Burnham. They were both there in Berlin, in West Germany, at the founding of the CCF. Congress for Cultural Freedom in the 50s and 60s claimed to be an organization of pro-freedom intellectuals, many of them liberal. Many of them were left-wing or center-left liberal. And the claim of the Congress for Cultural Freedom is that they were leftists or liberals against radicalism, against communism. Some of them were even Trotskyites, but they were against Stalinism and against the Soviet Union. Some of the biggest names in the conservative movement in the 50s and 60s. Some of the biggest magazines with a conservative or even liberal ideological orientation in the 50s and 60s received money from the Congress for Cultural Freedoms. Many names you'd recognize were involved with this group. And throughout those 2 decades, nobody knew that the entire time this outfit, which was providing seed money for magazines, radio stations, TV stations, books, book clubs, you name it, it was receiving money from the CIA the entire time. Many of the constituent projects did not even know about the connection. The Congress would provide money for a small magazine. They'd provide a grant for an intellectual. And the recipients of these grants themselves, in some cases, did not even know that ultimately the money came from the CIA. That was revealed many years later. So this is important to understand about how intelligence in America operates. Again, World War II and the Cold War, they're relying upon Jewish refugees. They see Israel as a bulwark against communism. The CIA, even the elements that are not Jewish, or even necessarily sympathetic to Israel because it is Jewish, they were very pro-Jewish because of what they believed they could gain in their fight against the Soviet Union with the organized Jewish community in the world and with the state of Israel. And then, and aside from that, the CIA is fighting an ideological battle against totalitarianism, against Stalinism. And so they're backing a lot of conservative intellectuals, liberal and conservative, that are saying, you know, even if they're not conservative, they're against radicalism. They're against the turn of the American left to full-fledged socialism and communism. And that is so that they could fortify American democracy and democracy even in Europe.
And also, I just made a tweet, guys, about this. Dude, they're trying to say that Nick is a Fed. Yo, let me tell you guys something, bro. If you get put on a fucking no-fly list, you ain't cooperating with the government. All right? Like, let me be fucking clear about this shit. Like, the fact that he was put on a no-fly list in itself is irrefutable proof that he wasn't cooperating with the government. And it's crazy to me how people are even fucking entertaining this
redacted
idea. If he was working with the government, as you guys, people try to claim, he wouldn't be banned everywhere. He wouldn't be put on a no-fly list. He wouldn't be fucking debanked. But again, they're doing this because he can't be stopped right now. Bruh, I'll tell you this right now. None of my informants would ever be on a no-fucking-fly list, man.
Now we got to get into William F. Buckley, understanding these things. So William F. Buckley is the head of National Review, criticizing Patrick Buchanan in 1991. But where does William F. Buckley come from? I'll read to you a little bit from his bio. William F. Buckley enrolled at Yale University after World War II. Very important that he was from Yale. he joined the Skull and Bones secret society. If you recall, so did George H.W. Bush about a year before he did, and so did other prominent people too. He edited the Yale Daily News, a student newspaper. In 1951, he was recruited into the CIA and worked with E. Howard Hunt in Mexico City, where his father had an oil company. While with the CIA, he published a book called God and Man at Yale, The Superstitions of Academic Freedom. Later, he left the CIA and became editor of the American Mercury. He continued to be active in right-wing politics. In 1953, he established the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists. So he's at Yale University after the war. He's recruited by one of his professors into the CIA. He allegedly leaves the CIA, and then he forms up this group called ISI, Intercollegiate Society of Individuals, which was created to counter a group of the same acronym of a similar name that was formed up by communists to support socialism. Then in 1955, he hits his big break. He founds National Review with Leo Buzzell. The early senior cadres of the journal included Yale professor Wilmore Kendall, who, as the chief CIA recruiter at Yale, was responsible for recruiting William F. Buckley into the CIA. It also included James Burnham, who was working for the OSS during World War II and was active in the Congress for Cultural Freedom. He was also reputed to have had a hand in the successful plan to overthrow Iran's Mossadegh and install the Shah in 1953. Also on the original board was William Rusher, formerly a hard-right captain in Army military intelligence. Marvin Lieberman met William F. Buckley in the 1950s and also helped to found the National Review. He was active in CIA projects internationally, including the Committee for a Free Asia, the World Anti-Communist League, and the American Chilean Council. Another OSS officer, William Casey, drew up the legal documents for the National Review. So William F. Buckley is at Yale. He gets recruited to the CIA by his professor, Wilmore Kendall. Then, after allegedly leaving the CIA, he forms up a Society for Free Market Individualists, a campus group, then starts up the National Review with no fewer than 5 former OSS or former CIA officers, including his professor that recruited him into the CIA, who was the head recruiter of the CIA at Yale, including James Burnham, who was at the founding of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. So it is obvious from the very beginning that William F. Buckley has a very similar story to Tucker Carlson. He's at an Ivy League university in New England, like Tucker Carlson. He's recruited by a professor to form up a student newspaper, write a conservative book against the communists, and to start up National Review, a publication that he had the help in founding with 5 other CIA officers, including ones that were involved in the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was providing grants and money on behalf of the CIA to anti-communist projects. This is William F. Buckley. But he wasn't the only one to attack Patrick Buchanan. What is the basis of attacking Patrick Buchanan in the 1990s? Tucker Carlson then, just like now, and even William F. Buckley too, they said the problem with Pat Buchanan is that there is a legitimate fight against certain neocons. William F. Buckley eventually endorsed Pat Buchanan. Tucker Carlson considers himself an adversary of the neocons. They said the problem with Pat Buchanan and people like me is not that we're working for the neocons. It's not that we're the enemy. The subtle critique by Buckley and Carlson, 2 creatures of the CIA, is that both of us are hurting the real battle against the neocons. And they take issue with the fact that me and Pat Buchanan did not treat this as an ideological phenomenon, but as a Jewish phenomenon, as an ethnic or religious phenomenon. It's important to establish now who the neocons even are. If that is the battle between the America Firsters and the neocons, if we can all agree on that, but there is a battle within America First about who's really fighting the neocons, and we look at who's on either side of that battle. It's William F. Buckley and Tucker Carlson against Pat Buchanan and Nick Fuentes. It's Buckley at Yale, recruited in the CIA, founded National Review with the CIA, Tucker Carlson with his dad running Voice of America, against Pat Buchanan and Nick Fuentes, the cranks, the crazies, the anti-Semites. Well, it might help elucidate who the real enemy of the neocons are to take a look at the neocons themselves. This is a blurb from Ron Unz talking about the neocons.
All right, very important. And you guys know, we've talked about them a bunch on our channel, right? Who these motherfuckers are. We just call them Jays, right? We already know. But it is important for you guys to kind of get the historical context of how these motherfuckers came into play.
From the same article as before. It says, quote, the term neoconservative had originally appeared in the early 1970s, applied by critics to a small group of social scientists and other intellectuals who had rejected the radicalism of the 1960s and gravitated towards more moderate positions. In 1965, Irving Kristol co-founded the Public Interest, a semi-academic quarterly journal focused on matters of social policy. Many of these individuals were Jews originally from New York City, often with deep personal roots in the non-Stalinist left, including Trotskyites. Also around that time, Commentary magazine, edited by Norman Podhoretz and based in the same city, New York, moved in a similar direction, replacing its enthusiasm for the radical new left with sharp criticism, becoming the leading American publication associated with the early neoconservative movement. In those pre-internet days, professionally produced print publications with a national circulation were an extremely scarce intellectual resource, and as such, could serve as the focal point for a nascent ideological movement. Okay? This is an important point to understand. In the 2020s, how do people get their ideas and information? We get it from social media. 15, 20, 30 years ago, how did people get their information? Cable news, television. But in those days, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the policymakers, the politicians, the intellectuals, they were influenced by intellectual magazines. Now, even if the magazines did not have a huge readership, even if they were not read by millions of people or even hundreds of thousands of people, even if they were read by a small audience, it matters who that audience was. And in those days, that audience was the opinion makers, the taste makers, the policy makers, the intelligentsia. So what Unz is talking about, and this is critical to understand the influence of the neocons, is that the Congress for Cultural Freedom with the CIA is funding all these small magazines. And you might not understand the significance of it, but these small magazines, these radio stations, these international television programs, like we talked about last week, as Dick Carlson himself said, this is the lifeblood. This is the bread and butter of political movements, domestically and internationally. This is the intellectual juice behind them. This influences them. So the article says, in the pre-internet days, it is these professional publications, which were scarce, the national circulation professional publications, that would be the focal point for an ideological movement. And that's how the neoconservatives got started. It says, but Commentary, one such magazine, again edited by Norman Podhoretz, was also the flagship publication of the American Jewish Committee. And Podhoretz himself deeply identified with Jewish issues. Those factors impacted his editorial line, which naturally included a major focus upon Israel and the Middle East along the plight of Soviet Jewry. Partly for such reasons, a hawkish foreign policy, including heavy emphasis on the Cold War, became important neocon concerns. So think about how this develops. We got to back up and talk about the history again. So in the 1950s, we are in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And very quickly, it becomes clear that Jews are going to be the intermediary between the Soviet Union and the United States. It is going to be Jews, Jewish spies, Jewish double agents. They act as the mediators. They're conducting arbitrage between the Soviets and the Americans. I'll give you a few examples. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonates an atomic bomb. How did the Soviet Union get the bomb when the Americans developed it in secrecy? How did the Soviets get it before the British, before the French? They got it through Jewish spies, like Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were Jewish communists in America that passed the secrets to Soviet spies. In 1956, Nikita Khrushchev, the general secretary who succeeded Joseph Stalin after his death in 1953, Khrushchev gave a famous speech in 1956, de-Stalinizing the Communist Party. For the first time ever, he destroyed the cult of personality around Stalin by criticizing the excesses of the purges and other policies like the 5-year plans that Stalin inflicted on Russia. It was so secretive, it was called the secret speech, and it was only delivered to the Communist Party. But the United States got their hands on it. How? Because of Jewish refugees that left the Soviet Union, gave it to Shin Bet, the Israeli intelligence agency, who gave it to the CIA. So how did the Soviets get the bomb? Jewish spies. How did the Americans get the secret speech? Jewish spies. If the United States is fighting a spy war,
they play both sides. And I've talked about this too, guys. Jonathan Pollard, right, worked with who was one of the worst spies of all time, by the way. This guy right here, okay? Who do you work with? The Russians. And he's in Israel right now. This dude should have been in prison for life for the fucking shit that he gave. But the Adelsons lobbied really hard to get him leniency from your boy Donald Trump. So Pollard was released from prison November 20, 2015 in accordance with federal guidelines at the time of his sentencing. On November 20, 2020, his parole expired and all restrictions were eliminated. On December 30th, 2020, Pollard and his second wife relocated within Israel, and he's in Jerusalem now. And this guy endorses Ben Gvir, who's a genocidal fuck, who calls openly for the massacre of Palestinians.
War, an intelligence war with the Soviet Union, Jews are going to be a very big part of that. And why is that? Because Jews live in Russia, Jews live in the United States. They live in Germany, they live in France, they live in the United Kingdom, they live in Italy. And they don't have allegiance to their home countries. They might have allegiance to Israel.
Shout out to Robin Kobe 24, appreciate that. And I've talked to you guys about this as well, as far as like allegiance to host countries. Bro, it doesn't matter. Left wing, right wing, bird always flies to Israel. I've told you guys this before.
They might have ideological affinity with communism. They might have ideological affinity with capitalism. But because they're not, strictly speaking, American or Russian by ethnicity or Italian or French, because they are stateless, they become free agents and they could pick sides depending on their
I think someone just rated us on Kick.
ideology, depending on their ideals. So an American Jew could be a ideological communist in their heart and betray America. A Russian Jew could be born in Russia but betray the Soviet Union because they're American in their heart. They're capitalist in their heart because they flee to Israel and they want to support Israel. Okay? So during the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, you have Americans that are engaged in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. But American Jewry, Russian Jewry, and Israel are somewhere in the middle. Now, the Americans are fighting with the Russians in Cuba, in Korea, in Vietnam. We're in the middle of an arms race, a space race. And for those that don't know, the space race is really an arms race. Because when we're building rockets that are ostensibly supposed to do satellites and go to the moon, they also have a dual use, which is as intercontinental ballistic missiles. So in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Americans are going crazy. The American leadership is going crazy because we're saying, how do we defeat this enemy? They seem to be everywhere. These countries are falling like dominoes. And the Soviets have a bigger conventional force in Europe. They have a bigger nuclear arsenal. They might have the advantage. This is what's happening in America. And so the Americans are funding these magazines to stall and to forestall communist influence in Europe and the United States. But there's something happening.
And guys, communism back then is like the equivalent to like the war on terror today. So it was a big fucking deal. We were putting all our money and resources into it. It's similar to, I would give it, basically say, the Red Scare, the Cold War, our conflict with Russia when it comes to communism. Back then, that's the equivalent of what the fight on terror is today. Being called a communist back then was what being called a terrorist is today.
Happening at the same time, which is that Israel is fighting a war for independence. Israel declares its independence in 1948. They fight a war with Egypt and Syria. Jewish organized crime in America runs guns illegally to Israel, which helps Israel decisively defeat a coalition of Egypt and Syria in the war.
And also, those weapons that were moved, right, from the United States here, they were smuggled through the ports. And the reason they were smuggled through the ports is because organized crime, aka the Italian mafia and the Jewish mafia, had control of these ports, and they would facilitate the smuggling of the guns, of the TNT, of the bombs. We talked about this in NUMEC, right? Utilizing South America to be transported over to Palestine. And the reason why this was a problem, guys, and why this was legal is because back then there was a oh my God. It was prohibited by customs law. It was, oh my God, I can't think of the term right now. But regardless, it was illegal to move the weapons over there. And the other thing, too, that you guys need to know is that these weapons ended up in the hands of Zionist paramilitary groups, okay? Before the IDF was created through the creation of Israel, there was a CERN gang, there was Irgun, and there was Haganah. These are Jewish terrorist groups and militias that basically operated in what became later known as Israel. And they would go ahead and conduct all types of terrorist attacks and militia operations, killing Palestinians all over the place, blowing places up. And they didn't just kill Palestinians, guys. They killed a lot of the Brits, too, because the Brits were trying to limit immigration from Europe of Jewish people to Palestine at the time. So this is why the King David bombing hotel and the assassination of British diplomats. So this was all going on, and it was facilitated and funded via organized crime in the United States run by the Italian and the Jewish mafia, who were in bed together, working together very closely, like Mayor Lansky, Lucky Luciano, etc. Mayor Lansky was like one of the top guys. He was a Russian Jew, and he worked very closely with Lucky Luciano because Mayor Lansky is the one that brokered Lucky Luciano's release from prison in exchange for working with the naval intelligence. So Lucky Luciano provided information to the naval intelligence and the American government on communism in exchange for being released from prison and also giving them access via the ports.
And an unsteady peace breaks out. In 1955, Israel does a major raid on Gaza and kills 35 Egyptians. Egypt is not receiving arms from the United States and Europe, but Israel is. So what does Egypt do? President Nasser turns to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union begins supplying weapons to Israel's enemies, Egypt and Syria. In 1956, Israel goes to war with Egypt. Throughout the 50s and 60s,
and this is a big deal. This is the Suez Canal crisis, what he's talking about. And the Suez Canal crisis, guys, basically is where the Israelis, the Brits, and the French, was it the Brits too? Okay, now I got to double check. Basically, they went and tried to take the canal, and they lost. And the U.S. told them they had to basically fucking run with their tail between their legs. And this is what led to them having to get the bomb. Yep, okay, UK, France, and Israel. Yep. Tried to invade in 1956. And Eisenhower ended up slapping them and telling, hey, you guys got to fucking cut this shit off.
60s, Israel's at war with its neighbors, with the Palestinians, with terrorist groups. Israel is fighting for its very survival. And as time goes on, Egypt and Syria and all the other Muslim countries are moving closer to the Soviet Union, and Israel is moving closer to the United States.
And this crisis, the Suez Canal crisis, one of the few times where we didn't align with them geopolitically because Eisenhower had some balls. This is before we became a super pro-Zionist government.
By the mid-1960s, when Lyndon Johnson is installed in the United States, we start pouring weapons into Israel.
Yep. And this is because Lyndon B. Johnson was a very pro-Zionist president. He was the first super pro-Zionist president. It's important for you guys to realize that before Lyndon B. Johnson came in as president of the United States, we had a very, we supported Israel, but at the same time, we also recognized Palestine. Okay, we also recognized their plight. And Eisenhower tried to avoid taking a side on this situation. And so did Kennedy, right? So it wasn't until your boy Lyndon B. Johnson came in that we pretty much took the gloves off and gave Israel everything they fucking wanted. They didn't have to register under FAIR anymore. We stopped inspecting their nuclear weapons. We started giving them more aid. We started supporting them. We like 10x'd our fucking foreign aid to Israel after Kennedy's death. So, yeah, dude. Lyndon B. Johnson was responsible for this current foreign policy we have with Israel where we give them everything that they want. He was the first one.
Whereas up until 1963, we were not giving Israel a lot of weapons. And that was in the pursuit of balance between Israel and the Arabs. All of a sudden, we were giving them tons of guns.
Yeah, Kennedy wanted to resolve this situation. And he knew that Israel having a nuclear weapon would fuck that up. That's why he was so against nuclear proliferation for Israel. JFK was.
And we really made the decision that Israel was going to be our country. They were going to be our bulwark against communism in the Middle East. Something very important happens in 1967. In 1967, Israel sees an opportunity to strike a crushing blow on Egypt and Syria, its prime adversaries, its most powerful adversaries on its southern and northern border. In the Six-Day War, Israel flies into Egypt and destroys its air force. Then Israel flies into Syria and destroys its air force. With total air superiority, Israel invades Gaza, Israel invades the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, and then Israel in the north takes the Golan Heights and nearly sieges Damascus in the north inside of Syria.
And to this day, they still have the Golan Heights. Still occupied by Israel to this day, chat.
And in 6 days, the war is over. Israel is bigger than ever. It now occupies not just the entire mandate of Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza, but it also occupies the Sinai and the Golan Heights. Israel is massive. Now, in response to this sneak attack, the Soviet Union begins giving more support to Egypt and Syria. The left wing in America, the American political left, has a harsh reaction. They view the Israeli war as aggression, as provocative. They view it as an occupation of these third world countries. And so the American political left and the Soviet Union turn against
Thank you for the 5 gifted, bro. Really appreciate that, man.
Israel. In 1973, Egypt and Syria have their revenge. They launch a surprise attack on Israel.
This was known as the Yom Kippur War. And they were going to fuck Israel up, by the way. But I think Nick is going to talk about that here. But yeah, they almost lost that war, chat, the Yom Kippur War.
Egypt invades the Sinai Peninsula from the Suez.
And this was after the, obviously, the fail of the 6-Day War, the 1967 war, which embarrassed the fuck out of the Arab world, by the way. Okay? It embarrassed them. They lost a lot of territory because of this.
Canal. Syria invades the Golan simultaneously. Israel is caught totally off guard. They're almost overrun and defeated.
And just so you guys know, I'll go ahead and show you guys this on a map because it's way easier. I've noticed that you guys like it when I show you guys this stuff on a map. So let's just type in Egypt on the map, right? Bam. So here's the Sinai Peninsula, and then the Golan Heights is up here, right? This area right here. So Syria invaded from the north, and then obviously the Egyptians hit from over here. So they basically had Israel sandwiched, okay? And this actually is a big reason why the 1978 Camp David Accords were signed, right? The United States did not want a hostile force to Egypt, to Israel's south. Because guess what? We have to support these guys. And we almost got into a nuclear war because of this fucking thing. So the Camp David Accords basically made it where Israel would also be, Egypt would be a huge recipient of foreign aid to play nice with Israel.
They come very close to the brink of annihilation. The United States initially is reluctant to bail them out. Israel threatens to use nuclear weapons.
Very important. Golda Meir, who was the prime minister at the time, called Nixon and said, if you don't fucking give us aid, if you guys don't help us in this conflict, we are going to blow up the Arab world. And not only did they say they were going to do it, they telegraphed that they were going to do it via moving assets. So the Israelis purposely moved nuclear assets openly above ground so satellites can keep can see it. And what ended up happening was the Russians saw this and told the Arabs, yo, they're moving nuclear assets. And this obviously was for posturing.
The prime minister of Israel at the time, Golda Meir, calls up Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger and says, if you don't give us support, if you don't bail us out, we will have to take extraordinary measures, implying nuclear weapons.
Yep, 100% true.
And they begin taking their nuclear warheads and putting them in public view of satellite imagery.
Let's go. I did not see this shit, bro.
Stupid.
Yo, oh, my bad. Yo, guys, I did not see this part of the thing. But there you go. And this is historical fact, by the way. This isn't just me and Nick saying it. Historians have even said this, that Israel publicly moved its nuclear assets so the Russians can see and tell the Arabs. This isn't me and Nick just telling you guys this shit because we don't like Israel. This is everybody's here? Okay. This is 100% true and been verified by multiple historians. Because up until this point, chat, no one knew if Israel had nuclear weapons. There was suspicion that they had nuclear weapons, but nobody knew 100%. And when Israel purposely telegraphed their nuclear capabilities by moving assets above ground, the Russians, with their satellites, told the Arabs. And then Nixon and them also found out. Because Kissinger wanted the Israelis to sweat a little bit. And Nixon. So it forced them to come in. Anyway, guys, I'll play this a little bit more, but I got to get going here in a second, guys. We got to start Fresh and Fit, Money Mondays.
To send the message to Nixon and Kissinger. Nixon and Kissinger bail out Israel with a massive airlift of weapons. And there's a very contentious period of negotiations between the Americans and the Soviets, the Israelis and the Egyptians, but eventually the war is settled. In 1975, the Soviet Union goes to the United Nations and they pass a resolution saying that Zionism is racism. The Soviet Union is now fully against Israel. And they're against Israel because they're backing Syria, they're backing Egypt, which Israel has just invaded, attacked, at war with, violating the terms of the ceasefire. The Soviet Union is backing Israel's enemies and passing resolutions in the UN objecting to Zionism itself. And the Soviet Union's allies in America, the American political left, is also decidedly against Israel. They say that Israel's colonizers, racists, they take the side of the Egyptians and the Syrians. And this is where many of the Jewish left-wingers that were supported by the Congress for Cultural Freedom in the 50s and 60s. Now remember, they themselves were communists. They were from New York. They were liberals. They were leftists. Remember, the purpose of the Congress for Cultural Freedom was to beat back the ideological influence of the Soviet Union by steering the left away from communism and Stalinism and towards a more moderate form of left-wing politics. And many of those intellectuals were...
All right, guys, we'll cover this. We'll see. Let me get through Fresh and Fit, guys, and then and then I'll see if I come back on later tonight or tomorrow.